All right, so welcome back to our notes on the 1950s. We're going to finish up with the notes today, and that'll be that for the 50s. Probably at the end of the week, probably Friday, we're going to have a test over the 1950s and the 40s and 50s, kind of all the stuff we've covered so far for the end of the quarter. I'll give you more details on that and where to take it as I make the test. So anyway, we'll finish up today with just a little bit. I want to talk about television a little bit and the Red Scare of the 1950s and what that meant. So anyway, we'll get right to it. So let's talk about television in the 1950s. So television first debuts in 1947. Okay, so that's the first time that there was actually a station where people could watch TV. So very few people had televisions, and very few people had televisions in the early 1950s as well. But by the end of the decade, most homes had a television, probably about 80 to 90%. By the end of the 1950s have a television. So television grows at a real rapid pace during the 1950s and becomes a really, really important aspect of American society. Our values, our cultural values are shown through television. Our attitudes and beliefs are characterized through television. So a lot of the stuff that we're into and a lot of stuff that we pay attention to, we all get through our television and the stuff that we watch. And this week we'll watch a couple examples of some 1950s TV shows, and you'll kind of get an idea for yourself what this is all about. So in the 1950s, television is dominated really by just the three stations. Now, at first, there were only two. There were only two stations, but into the 1950s, we had a third station. So at first, there's just CBS and NBC, and then later, in the 50s, you get ABC. And this is it. There was no cable television back in the 1950s. So these were the channels that you had to watch. And each station would kind of have programming that would be very similar. They'd compete with one another for an audience by showing shows that were very similar in nature. Okay. Probably the most noteworthy show of the 1950s is, of course, I Love Lucy. I Love Lucy was a groundbreaking comedy for several reasons. It featured a real-life married couple, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, and basically it was a story about their life in the city and the experiences that they had. But the show centered on Lucy, Lucille Ball's character, and as few other programs did during that time, the woman was the pivotal and main character of the show. And the show featured kind of the similar thing every time. You would have Lucy getting herself into some sort of difficult situation because she, made a foolish decision, and she'd get herself into trouble. And, that's how the story would work. Sometimes there'd be something where she did something to her husband, to Ricky, on the show, and he would, he would kind of need her to save him at the end or whatever. But it was one of the most iconic, still one of the most iconic shows in the history of television, and is probably generally regarded as the first great sitcom, situation comedy, half-hour shows that are meant to be humorous. These shows often, are half-hour long, and they basically are about the same thing. There's a positive resolution at the end of the episode. It's family-oriented oftentimes, especially some of these other shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. Shows like these are shows that, again, are meant to be watched by the family. It reinforces family values. Father knows best, right? That's all 1950s. Each episode would basically feature some sort of circumstance, somebody getting themselves into trouble, but finishes with a positive resolution, a message. So a message about something, to tell the audience, something positive, something good. Usually It is the father or mother telling the kid about something mischievous that they may have been involved with. But these shows always try to reinforce family values. In fact, Father Knows Best was heavily regulated by the government in terms of the script writing because they wanted to reinforce a lot of these family values in the writing of the show. So they would kind of almost have the government like make episodes where they would kind of reinforce the ideas of what an American family is supposed to be. Shows like Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, Make Room for Daddy are all kind of the same thing. Shows that center on the family, that feature something silly but not bad happening, and then a positive resolution at the end. By the end of the 1950s, the situation comedy, which are all shows like these, although they were very popular, is overtaken by the westerns. In the second half of the 1950s, westerns become the most popular shows on television, and there's many of them. Gunsmoke, Rawhide, Have Gun, Will Travel, Bonanza. These shows by the end of the 1950s are extremely popular in America and become popular around the world. Why? Because they reinforce the American cultural ideal, right? There's nothing more American than a Western. You have that Western hero, that cowboy out there standing up against evil, bad guys or whatever it is, and there's a gunfight at the end, and the stories are all fairly similar. But Westerns are very popular because they reinforce the American culture and social and cultural ideals. Just like John Wayne films were very popular, and John Wayne was very popular because his characters and the themes of those movies and the themes of these Western TV shows, again, reinforce our social and our cultural ideals. And that's very important to the American people. That's very important to those that go out and enjoy watching these programs. The other type of popular show during the 1950s was the variety show, and the most popular variety show host of the 1950s was Ed Sullivan. People enjoyed variety shows. You could watch when the Ed Sullivan show would air on Sunday nights, and it would usually have like a musical act, like this is where Elvis was on there famously. The Beatles would be on there in the 60s. The Jackson 5, a lot of different groups would be on there before the show went off in 1973. But you'd have sometimes an animal act. Sometimes you'd have just kind of two people having a conversation. Ed Sullivan would have a guest. There would be some sort of musical act. There would be a comedian. These are variety shows that the family could sit and watch, and you'd see all kinds of different things. And the Ed Sullivan Show was one of the most iconic programs of the really 20th century as a whole. A lot of important people in music and comedy and otherwise made their debuts or became very famous after appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show. So the cultural impact of the Ed Sullivan Show is really, really significant. The other important piece of television during the 1950s deals with news. And the most important newsman in the 1950s was a guy by the name of Edward R. Murrow. He had a show that was kind of like 60 Minutes. It was called See It Now. And on that show, they would discuss news topics and things like that. This is a groundbreaking type of program. He would bring on a politician or bring on someone significant to talk about events of the day. And as we'll talk about here in a minute, it was also his style of reporting and skill that would bring down Joe McCarthy during the Red Scare, which is something that we'll talk about here in a second. But it also, again, Edward R. Murrow knows that television is really a really important medium, right? People are going to watch TV and formulate opinions on TV, just like people formulated opinions about the aliens when the War of the Worlds broadcast happened. Okay, so we're going to see kind of these same patterns evolve. But here, Edward R. Murrow and other newscasters of the day are going to use the news platform hoping to achieve more positive results. Here's Edward R. Murrow right there. I Love Lucy's title card was popular. There's a picture from Leave It to Beaver, the Leave It to Beaver game. Another thing that was unique about television shows in the 50s is they capitalized off merchandise as well. So you can play, you have games like this one that focus on a TV show, Leave It to Beaver. And then this, of course, is Ed Sullivan, the popular variety show host from the 50s. All right, so as I told you before, we're going to talk a little bit about the Red Scare. Now, what the Red Scare was basically this general fear in the 1950s of communism and the threat that communism brought to the United States. People were terrified about communist subversion, as we call it. Okay. In other words, these are communists. These are people that are hiding kind of in plain sight in America that want to turn America and Americans communist. Okay. And this is something that people are really, really scared of. In fact, people got so crazy about it that books would be banned from, libraries and schools and things like that. One notable example is Robin Hood. The book Robin Hood, the story of Robin Hood, was banned from libraries and schools because the idea of robbing from the rich and giving to the poor sounded too communist. Okay, so even for a time, Robin Hood was something that was kind of banned. Hollywood becomes a big, big target of the Red Scare movement. They realize the influence that media can have on people's opinions. So, the government and others try to kind of use their influence to, better themselves either politically or, to get rid of communist fears that exist in this country. Okay. In fact, there was a group created called the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, House Un-American, sorry about the writing, Activities Committee. And basically their job was to root out any activities or any things, particularly in Hollywood, that would be considered communist or a threat to America as a whole. Okay, what this would result in is something. Hold on. Oops. Okay, sorry, I went a little bit too far. What this would result in often is something called blacklisting. And basically, if you were blacklisted, you would be kind of kicked out of Hollywood. You could be like kicked out of Hollywood or kicked out of your job. If you were blacklisted, it meant that you had some sort of tie or alleged affiliation to communism, and therefore, in the culture of the 1950s, you were pretty bad, okay? And people didn't want to be associated with you. So, it wrecked a lot of people's careers. I mentioned Frank Sinatra as a singer. He was kind of associated with some questionable activities, and he was kind of blackballed or blacklisted for a while, but he is one of the few examples of people whose careers actually got resurrected. Many people's careers and lives were ruined, particularly in Hollywood, particularly screenwriters and some like producers and directors whose careers were really negatively impacted by this blacklisting movement. There were examples that caused fear in America of people that actually had ties to communism. It's found out that an older couple from New York, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, pictured here, had sold plans and secrets to the Soviet Union while we were building the atomic bomb during World War II. The Rosenbergs looked like everyday normal people, but were found guilty of espionage and treason and were sentenced to death. And in 1953, were both killed on the electric chair. Okay, we are so afraid and scared of the effects of communism that even simple-looking, innocent-looking people can be considered communists. So this image here, if you look at that for a second, you see these two people. They're Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They're about to be taken off to jail. And they were guilty. They certainly were. But it freaks everybody out because everybody thinks these are the most normal looking people out there. If they can be traitors to the country, then anybody can, right? And it creates this sense of fear and distrust in the country, probably somewhat similar to some of the feelings that exist today for a lot of people. It creates this fear and distrust in America that it took us some time to recover from. Somebody else that stokes the fires of that distrust is Joe McCarthy, this guy here. Again, this is an example of a politician who takes advantage of people's emotions and feelings for their own benefit. So Joe McCarthy was a struggling senator from Wisconsin who wanted to get reelected. And he took it up as his personal crusade to root communism out of the government. So he was giving a speech in West Virginia, and all of a sudden he comes up with these papers and says that I have lists of 205 names on these papers of State Department, of government employees that are communists. This sparks, again, as you would expect, a lot of fear in the country and the government about communism and the threats that it's presenting to the United States. And so McCarthy starts to get a following. He starts to become popular. But ultimately, McCarthy starts appearing on television. And he keeps making wild accusations. And Edward R. Murrow, the guy that we talked about before, has him on his show. And he asked McCarthy if he could name any names, could name anybody from that list, and McCarthy couldn't. And essentially what happens is McCarthy gets kind of discredited, and it kind of destroys his career. He ultimately doesn't get reelected senator, and he dies a few years later. But a couple takeaways from that. It causes widespread fear and concern about communism in the country. Everybody's a communist. Everybody is living in this sense of fear in the 1950s. If there's not communists out there, there's going to be a nuclear attack or whatever it might be. Everybody is really, really anxious about this. We also see the influence again of television, just like we saw the influence of radio with the War of the Worlds. Joe McCarthy appears on television on Edward R. Murrow's show and gets found out to be a liar and someone who was making a story up for personal benefit. He also appears before the Senate subcommittee hearing because he had accused some military personnel of being communists with no evidence, and he gets pretty much destroyed there as well. So again, this is an example of the power of media and the power of television affecting people's opinions. McCarthy can go out and say that all these people are communists, and people can get behind him and support it because he says it on air, on television. But then when he gets questioned about it by people like Murrow, by people like Edward R. Murrow, he also gets found out to be a fraud. Television, media has a big impact on what we think and what we believe. We talked about blacklisting already. I think that's it. Again, we'll have a test on Friday. I'll have an assignment for you with some stuff regarding some TV shows this week. I'll get that to you tonight or tomorrow. Anyway, I think that's it, and I will talk to you later. Bye.